Well, good morning, everyone, and what a treat it is to be here with so many people who I have met in the past and are new friends, and look forward to sharing some of my experiences with international neurosurgery and where I've ended up with nutrition, and kind of the story of how I got there. Sorry, this is obviously right. And I have recently retired from neurosurgery. And I'm just going to go through a little bit of my past. I grew up in Canada. It's colder in Canada, snows more. We have lovely summers, and of course, hockey is a big part of Canadian life. I did my medical school at the University of Manitoba. For internship, I went to Los Angeles, where I was at the county hospital. It was a lot different from Manitoba, particularly the politicians. You might recognize this from the Terminator. I returned to Canada after my internship, and I attended then the University of Calgary, where I was the second Canadian female neurosurgeon. My daughter, who you saw was the third neurosurgeon in Canada. I would have stayed there, except they blew up my hospital, the Calgary General Hospital, for financial expediency. One wonders about political decisions, of course. So after that, I had established a spinal injury program in Calgary, and I was very disgusted by the whole situation. So I moved to the United States, and myself and my other neurosurgical partner, Oliver Dold, ended up in Decatur, Illinois. And I spent a very pleasant 11 years in Decatur. And I ended up changing at that point, I had been a neurosurgeon for close to 25 years. And a series of family situations really required my attention. And so I had to figure out a way to slow down from neurosurgery. And most of you in this room know that that's not an easy thing to do. But I ended up doing part-time neurosurgery, taking a lot of call, because I always actually enjoyed the call aspects of neurosurgery. I found the most interesting patients and the most challenging parts of it. So I actually decided I was going to spend my neurosurgical career doing a combination of call and administrative work. And I was actually inspired by Dr. Dempsey at one of these conferences to do international volunteer work. So I ended up in Corvallis, Oregon, which is a delightful spot. I truly did land butter side up on this one. And I now have a lovely cabin at Cascade Head Ranch. I'm retired, and I have spent a lot of my life doing now, the last 10 years, international volunteer work. So my first experience in this was in 2009. And here's Dr. Susil Sipakar and the Tribhuvan University Teaching Hospital at that time. And he is truly an inspiring individual. I can't imagine going to China, learning Chinese in 2 years, and graduating from medical school, returning to Nepal, and then being trained as a neurosurgeon, general surgeon and neurosurgeon. I mean, truly a very inspiring individual, and it was a real privilege to work with him for 2 to 3 months. But when I was there, I was struck by some very talented young people. Ali will recognize Bishnu there. I taught Bishnu his very first craniotomy. And Narendra Banskota, who is now a neurosurgeon with the Army. And I realized that these young, talented people really had incredible knowledge of basic medicine and surgical technique. And I was so impressed by their capability and really felt that what they needed a lot of was equipment and support. And obviously, Fines had an extremely capable group of volunteers. But what I was struck with was in the outpatient clinic, the incredible number of neural tube defects that we saw. And I came to realize rather late in my career, the importance of public health, nutrition, and the basics of medicine. So I then went on a trek. And when I was trekking, I spoke with many, many people, mostly young women, community leaders. And many of these folks have remained my very good friends. This man, Captain Dampoon, who was a Gurkha, and who had returned to his hometown of Gurapani and started a motel, he spent his Army career as a high diver. And what he's showing me here are his many medals from international high diving competition. But Captain Dam really wanted to do something more for his community. And so he and I were talking about how to improve the medical care within his community. And he has remained instrumental in my connections with Nepal. And actually, he is now the elected official in Annapurna Magdi region. And he and I are going to speak again in next month about restarting a nutrition program in this area. And I'll get into that in just a little bit. But as I was walking through Nepal during this, sorry, there was a couple of other pictures there. Anyway, as I was walking through Nepal, I was struck by the agriculture and the food production and everything else that was occurring in rural Nepal was very disconnected from Kathmandu. And there really wasn't a system of medical care being funneled back into Kathmandu. It was pretty ad hoc. But I was particularly struck as I was thinking about and learning much more about folic acid nutrition and how to prevent neural tube defects, that the techniques that we were using in North America weren't going to work in Nepal. 70% of rural Nepal grows 100% of its own food. So, I mean, that's just a striking statistic that isn't present even in a lot of other low-resource countries. So, I mean, can you imagine growing 100%? This includes rice, all of their vegetables, their animal products. Everything is pretty well grown. So you're not going to fortify food and have an impact on neural tube defects. So after a lot of thought, I realized that this was really going to only be done with a type of supplementation. And so I formed a partnership with Vitamin Angels and developed an organization called Global Nutrition and Empowerment, because we consider that nutrition is a way to empower people. And after a number of years, particularly between 2011 and 2015, I returned to Nepal and started a project with Vitamin Angels, and we were able to distribute prenatal vitamins to over 20,000 women, childbearing age, in 9 districts in rural Nepal. And during that time, I was particularly struck by the power of education and how eager people in communities were to receive information that they had no access to. And this group of women just showed up. They'd walk 10, 15 miles to come just to hear about a talk on nutrition and vitamins and receive a bottle of prenatal vitamins. I mean, can you imagine in the United States anybody walking for 10 to 15 miles just to get a bottle of vitamins and to hear somebody talk about the power of nutrition? So this was absolutely an incredible experience. But the forms of education are a real challenge. A lot of times these buildings where you're going to be talking to people are noisy. When it rains, you can't hear anything. So the method of educating has really, to my mind, kind of changed my thoughts. So we finished that project in Nepal, and we're about to institute a large project in one of the districts when the earthquake earthquake struck. And we changed our focus from vitamin distribution to earthquake reconstruction. And one of the young men who has been instrumental in this entire Nepal project, who you've seen in a couple of slides, Narayan Bandari, he basically took the money that we raised for G&E, and he initially housed and fed approximately 5,000 people post-earthquake. And then he organized and built 23 temporary schools. And these are the temporary schools that you see. And when we returned a year later to look at the projects that had been completed, we're about a mile away, and you can see all the school kids that were lined up waiting to greet us, to thank us for these schools. Most of these schools are still in use, and after the 23 temporary schools, we were able to build 3 other permanent schools. But that did interrupt our nutrition work for a while. And as that was interrupted, I began thinking an awful lot about the brain and brain development, because as a neuroscientist, that's obviously of great interest, and the impact that a whole variety of different issues have on the development of the brain, and poverty in particular. And how does poverty affect the brain? There's physical, chemical, biochemical issues that impact a developing fetal brain and child's brain. And this I thought, this article that was in Nature really summarized it beautifully, and I would suggest that folks read it. It's really a very interesting read. But really what it comes down to is that for a fetus and an infant to develop their brain and their body and their mind, they need a variety of support systems. And it has to start with a healthy mother that has good nutrition, and then breastfeeding is incredibly important, a safe environment. The toxicity to a developing brain of cortisol is really quite incredible. And the structural and biochemical changes to an infant's brain really set up a vicious circle that really you have to have all of these elements to be able to elevate a child and a family out of poverty. So the antithesis to that, of course, is when you have inadequate nutrition, poor maternal health, poor fetal development, and adverse childhood events with cortisol and stress, you just emphasize that circle of poverty, and it's really hard for folks to get out of it. So that, I sort of broadened my perspective from just prevention of neural tube defects, which had been the focus up to this point, to let's look at things a little more holistically and try and develop some other programs, still with an emphasis on nutrition. But just because of this audience, we'll talk just a touch about folic acid and B12 and a bit of a refresher course for folks. But any one of these essential vitamins and minerals has a similar kind of impact and story. But truly, from a neurosurgical perspective, you can cost-effectively pencil out the entire program for nutrition and micronutrient supplementation just by the cost effectiveness of providing people with folic acid and folate. So we're very familiar with neural tube defects, and for those of us with a lot of gray hair in the audience, and there's a few, I'm sure most of you will remember that at least once or twice a week there'd be a call to the neonatal unit for a child with a neural tube defect. Well, now that is such a rare event in North America that residents, when a child is born with one of these terrible brain or spinal defects, people are called from all over the city to come and see this unusual event. Thank goodness, in North America. And it's unusual because of food fortification that began in 1991, only 1991. Was food fortified, and the reason that we have all the fortification of our cereals is all our cereals and grains is because of prevention of neural tube defects. So if we, if we just look at the pathophysiology again of neural tube defects, and this will take you back to first year medical school, but that neural tube closes at 23 days post conception. So well before a mother recognizes that she's pregnant. So if a young mother does not have adequate folic acid at that time, she's at much higher risk of developing a neural tube defect, a child with a neural tube defect. So the critical time for having a mother have their folic acid is prior to conception. And hence, you need to have moms get their folic acid, all women of childbearing age. And, you know, the impact of having a child with a neural tube defect is incredible, both for that child, for the family, for the medical system. And considering that you could prevent 70% of these children from having this condition by moms taking folic acid is pretty powerful. So that's kind of what motivates me, is prevention of both neural tube defects and many other related conditions. So where in the world are neural tube defects and other malnutrition problems prevalent? Actually, the statistics are very poor. But one of the high points is in Guatemala, where greater than 22 children per 10,000 births are struck with this terrible birth defect. Just for my friends from Nepal, food insecurity and dietary restrictions are common in rural Nepal, and in this statistic, in this study, there's a very low formal education rate, and over half of households are food insecure. We will look at moving forward through the Sustainable Development Goals in the goals for 2030. The first 4 or even 6, you could say, are related to adequate nutrition and micronutrient deficiencies. You can't get out of poverty without mothers and families having adequate nutrition. Obviously, you can't have zero hunger. You can't have good health and well-being without being healthy, etc. You can't learn in school without adequate nutrition. So when we move on to the whole education situation, and these are projects that we have done in Nepal, Indonesia, Philippines, and Guatemala, we're struck by the power of education and how eager women in particular are to learn. And we came up with the idea that we should really be providing the teachers of these women with adequate tools for education. And the woman that you see in the pink shawl is a lady that has been instrumental in my thoughts on this. She's a community health volunteer. And community health volunteers, if those of you aren't familiar, are the women who volunteer in their communities to be the foundation for public health. And most of the time, the women in all the countries that I've mentioned only get a maximum 2 weeks of education and health care. But they're responsible for the well-being of all the women and children in their community. And so they really need some tools to help them with education. I'm going to skip over this. And so the classic way of educating folks is with flip charts. And we tried flip charts, and we tried teaching people with projectors, et cetera, but we came down to using digital tablets. And the reason being is that you can either educate a group of people together, or you can have earphones and get rid of the loud noise. You can have a fairly complex message which is delivered consistently. And in addition, you can collect data as well. So far we've developed 3 nutrition education apps, one on general one on general nutrition, one on nutrition and pregnancy, and one for young children. And they're interactive, they're fun, they are socially relevant, clothing's relevant, food's relevant for each of the countries that we have developed these for.
Hi, my name is Dee Dee, and I'm a nutritionist and a community health volunteer. I have gathered the best information available about how nutritious food gives you the power to be healthy and stay healthy. The information is for everyone, everywhere. Eating nutritious foods is important for you to be healthy and stay healthy, and you have the power to choose.
So right now we have projects in these countries, and they're growing. We have a big project with a public health department in Indonesia, which will go on for 5 years. And each of these others are growing. As we also look at this, diabetes and the double burden of a combination of malnutrition and obesity is increasing around the world. And so we're developing apps on diabetes, reproductive health, and for post-bariatric surgery as well. I'm just going to end by just giving a little thought-provocative comment about micronutrient deficiencies in the population that you're concerned about in spinal surgery. And vitamin D deficiency is a really significant deficiency and significantly impacts patient results following spinal surgery. And I would encourage you to consider that as you look at your patients and their potential nutritional deficits. And I'll just end by this quotation from Mahatma Gandhi. I think it echoes an awful lot of what Dr. Dempsey was talking about, and that each of us in this room has the capability of lighting 1,000 candles and having a huge impact. And I just say in closing that your degree as a physician, as an MD, is as powerful, if not more powerful, than your degree as a neurosurgeon. And as you are thinking of perhaps ways of slowing down your practice and changing what you're doing, how you're doing it, that don't give up that MD degree. There's lots of things that you can do in the world where that really matters. And you don't have to be a surgeon, and you don't have to do an awful lot of high-tech stuff to have a huge impact. And thanks for the opportunity, Richard, to talk to you, and enjoy the rest of the meeting.